If you open a standard history textbook to find the date the British Empire ended, you will likely find a vague reference to the independence of India in 1947, or perhaps the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. These are the polite diplomatic answers. But if you look at the balance sheets of the Bank of England and the secret cables of the US Treasury, the empire did not fade away gracefully. It was murdered. And it was murdered on a specific Tuesday, November 6th, 1956. This was the day of the Suez Crisis, an event remembered as a military humiliation, but which was, in reality, the first successful deployment of modern financial warfare by the United States against its closest ally. The weapon used to destroy the British Empire was not a nuclear missile or a carrier strike group. It was a run on the pound sterling orchestrated from Washington, D.C. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, we must rewind to the aftermath of World War II. The United Kingdom had won the war, but it had lost the economy. To defeat Hitler, Britain had liquidated nearly all of its foreign assets and taken on crushing amounts of debt. By 1945, the empire was technically insolvent. It was kept alive only by a massive injection of cash known as the Anglo-American Loan of 1946. The United States lent Britain $3.75 billion, about $60 billion today, to keep the lights on in London. But this loan came with a poison pill. The U.S. demanded that the pound sterling be made convertible, meaning it could be freely exchanged for U.S. dollars. This was a trap. The Americans knew that the moment the pound was convertible, everyone holding British currency would dump it to buy American goods, destroying the British reserves. It was a mechanism designed to transfer global financial hegemony from London to New York. For a decade, Britain struggled against these chains, maintaining the illusion of being a superpower. They still had a massive navy. They still ruled vast territories in Africa and Asia. And crucially, they still controlled the Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the global economy through which 70% of Europe's oil flowed. The canal was owned by a British-French company, a remnant of the 19th century colonial order. It was the physical symbol of British dominance. If Britain held Suez, it held the keys to the world's energy. But in July 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the nationalist president of Egypt, nationalized the canal. He simply seized it. This was an intolerable insult to the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden. Eden was an old-school imperialist who saw Nasser as a new Mussolini. He believed that if Britain allowed a former colony to seize imperial property, the entire empire would collapse like a house of cards. He decided that Nasser had to be removed, but Eden knew the United States, led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, would not support a colonial war. Eisenhower was running for re-election on a peace platform and wanted to court the Arab world to keep them out of the Soviet orbit. So Britain resorted to conspiracy. In a secret villa in Sèvres, outside Paris, British diplomats met with representatives from France and Israel. They hatched the Protocol of Sèvres, a plot so cynical it sounds like fiction. The plan was for Israel to attack Egypt across the Sinai. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to separate the combatants to protect the canal. When Egypt inevitably refused, Britain and France would invade, seize the canal, and topple Nasser, all while pretending to be peacekeepers. It was a classic 19th century gunboat diplomacy maneuver. On October 29, 1956, the plan was executed. Israeli paratroopers dropped into the Sinai. Britain and France issued their ultimatum. The bombing of Egyptian airfields began. From a military perspective, Operation Musketeer was a flawless success. The British Royal Marines and French paratroopers stormed Port Said and pushed down the canal. The Egyptian army was routed. Militarily, the empire was winning. They had the tanks, the jets, and the troops on the ground. They were hours away from total control of the Suez. But in Washington, Eisenhower was furious. He felt betrayed by his allies, who had launched a war behind his back just days before the U.S. election. He decided to teach the British a lesson they would never forget. He didn't send the U.S. Navy to stop the British fleet. He sent the U.S. Treasury to destroy the British currency. Eisenhower ordered the Federal Reserve to begin selling its reserves of pound sterling. Simultaneously, he ordered the U.S. agents at the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to block Britain's request for emergency withdrawals. Britain was operating on a razor-thin margin of foreign currency reserves. They needed access to the IMF to support the pound during the war. The U.S. effectively froze Britain's accounts. Then the shadow run began. Speculators in New York, sensing the blood in the water and emboldened by leaks from the White House, began shorting the pound aggressively. The Bank of England started bleeding gold. In the first few days of November 1956, Britain lost $50 million in reserves per day. At that burn rate, the Bank of England would be bankrupt in 2 weeks. If the reserves hit zero, the pound would collapse. The UK would be unable to import food or oil, and the economy would implode into a depression that would make the 1930s look mild. On November 6th, while British troops were winning firefights in Port Said, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, called Prime Minister Eden. The phone call was the death knell of the empire. Macmillan told Eden, "We can't go on. The Americans are selling the pound. We are losing reserves at a catastrophic rate. If we don't announce a ceasefire by midnight, the pound will be devalued, and we will be insolvent." Eden was stunned. He had the military victory in his hand, but he had no money to pay for it. He had to choose. Keep the canal and bankrupt the nation, or give up the canal and save the pound. He chose the pound. At 5 p.m. on November 6, 1956, Britain announced a ceasefire. The troops were ordered to stop. They eventually withdrew in humiliation, replaced by UN peacekeepers. Nasser kept the canal. The British Prime Minister resigned in disgrace shortly after. This was the moment the world changed. It was the Suez Moment. It proved to the world that a nation, even a great power with nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers, is powerless if it does not control its own currency and its own debt. Britain had the ships, but America had the ledger. The empire didn't die because it lost the will to fight. It died because its credit line was cut. The United States demonstrated that it was now the global hegemon, not just militarily, but financially. It showed that the US dollar was the only vote that mattered. If you crossed Washington, they didn't need to bomb you. They just needed to dump your bonds. This is the mechanism of control that governs the world today. The Suez Crisis was the debut of the dollar weapon. The psychological shock to the British establishment was total. They realized they were no longer a sovereign entity. They were a junior partner, a satellite state of the American financial system. This triggered a massive shift in British strategy. Realizing they could no longer compete as an imperial power, the City of London decided to reinvent itself. If they couldn't rule the waves, they would rule the waves of capital. This led directly to the creation of the Eurodollar market, an unregulated offshore market for dollars based in London. Ironically, the very currency that destroyed their empire, the dollar, became the product they started selling to the world. Britain pivoted from being the policeman of the world to being the banker of the world's shadow money. But the age of independent British foreign policy was over. Since 1956, Britain has never launched a major military operation without explicit American permission. The Falklands War in 1982 was the exception that proved the rule. And even then, Thatcher relied heavily on secret U.S. logistical and intelligence support and U.S. restraint in not dumping the pound. The lesson of 1956 is critical for understanding the Project Sandman scenario we discussed today. The British Empire collapsed because it was dependent on a foreign reserve currency, the dollar, to settle its trade. When the issuer of that currency, the U.S., decided to weaponize it, the empire vanished in 48 hours. Today, the United States is in the position of 1956, Britain. We are the overextended military power. We have the deficits. We are dependent on foreign nations, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, to buy our debt to keep the lights on. We think we're invincible because we have 11 aircraft carriers. But Britain had the aircraft carriers too. What happens when the creditors decide to pull the plug? What happens when Beijing or Riyadh decides to do to the US dollar what Eisenhower did to the British pound? The Suez Moment for America is approaching. It won't start with an invasion. It will start with a failed bond auction. And just like Anthony Eden, the American president will receive a phone call from the Treasury Secretary saying, "We can't go on. They are selling the bonds." In the next section, we will examine the Anglo-American Loan of 1946 in detail, specifically looking at the convertibility clause that the U.S. Treasury inserted. We will see how this clause was essentially a Trojan horse, designed to drain Britain's gold reserves long before the first paratrooper landed in Egypt, proving that the financial war had been planned a decade in advance. To fully comprehend the betrayal of 1956, one must look 10 years prior to the smoke-filled rooms of Washington, D.C. in the autumn of 1945. The war was over. The confetti from VE Day had been swept away, and the British government woke up to a terrifying reality. They were bankrupt. The United Kingdom had spent its entire national wealth defeating the Nazis. They had sold their foreign investments, liquidated their gold reserves, and accumulated a mountain of debt to their own colonies, known as the sterling balances. To keep the population fed and the factories running, Britain needed dollars. They needed to import wheat, oil, and machinery, and the only country selling those things was the United States. So, the British government sent their greatest intellectual weapon, the economist John Maynard Keynes, to Washington to negotiate a financial lifeline. Keynes arrived in Washington believing he would be treated as a hero. He expected the Americans to offer a grant in aid, a gift, in recognition of Britain's lone stand against Hitler in 1940. He argued that Britain had sacrificed its economy to save Western civilization, and therefore the U.S. should help rebuild it without strings attached. He was wrong. The American negotiators led by the ruthless Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, did not see Britain as a partner. They saw her as a rival to be dismantled. The U.S. State Department had a long-term strategic goal: to destroy the imperial preference system. This was a trade agreement that allowed Britain and its colonies, the Sterling area, to trade with each other using low tariffs while putting high tariffs on American goods. It was a closed economic fortress that locked U.S. exporters out of markets in India, Africa, and Australia. The Americans were determined to use Britain's desperation to pry these markets open. The result was the Anglo-American Loan of 1946. It was not a gift. It was a commercial loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest. But the interest rate was not the problem. The weapon was buried in the fine print, the convertibility clause. The U.S. demanded that, within 1 year of receiving the money, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible into U.S. dollars for current account transactions. At the time, the pound was a blocked currency. If an Indian merchant sold tea to Britain, he received pounds, but he could only spend those pounds in Britain or the Empire. He couldn't take those pounds to New York to buy a Ford truck. The system kept the money trapped inside the British Empire, propping up the British economy. Harry Dexter White knew that if he forced Britain to make the pound convertible, all those Indian merchants, and Egyptian and Australian, would immediately dump their pounds to buy dollars because everyone wanted American goods. Keynes argued that this would cause a run on the Bank of England. He warned that Britain wasn't strong enough to support the pound on the open market. The Americans didn't care. Their ultimatum was simple: sign the clause or starve. Britain, facing bread rationing at home, signed. The trap was set. It sprung on July 15, 1947. The date convertibility officially went into effect. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was a financial hemorrhage. Countries that had been holding vast piles of sterling IOUs from the war rushed to the window to exchange them for dollars. The Bank of England's reserves began to drain at a rate that defied physics. In June 1947, Britain's dollar deficit was huge. By August, it was terminal. The loan, which was supposed to last 5 years to help Britain rebuild, was being incinerated in weeks. It was the Great Drain. On August 20th, 1947, just 36 days after convertibility began, Britain was forced to suspend it. They broke their promise to the U.S., but the damage was done. The vast majority of the loan was gone. Britain was now even more desperate than before, having burned its lifeline for nothing. This event, known as the Convertibility Crisis of 1947, was the moment the British elite realized the war was truly lost. They realized that the U.S. Treasury controlled their survival. To avoid total collapse, Britain had to go back to Washington, hat in hand, and ask for the Marshall Plan aid. But Marshall Plan aid came with even more conditions, including U.S. oversight of British budgets and economic policy. Britain had effectively become a receiver-managed subsidiary of USA Inc. This financial subjugation explains the hesitation and eventual failure of 1956. When Eisenhower threatened to sell the pound during the Suez Crisis, he wasn't making a vague threat. He was pressing on a bruise that had been created in 1947. He knew exactly how fragile the sterling was because his predecessors had engineered that fragility. The 1946 loan agreement ensured that Britain could never again operate as an independent geopolitical actor. It dismantled the economic walls of the empire. Once the colonies realized that the pound was unstable and that the US dollar was the true store of value, their loyalty shifted. India, Pakistan, and the African colonies began to demand independence not just for political reasons, but for economic survival. They wanted to trade with the US directly. They didn't want to be tethered to a dying currency in London. The Winds of Change speech by Harold Macmillan in 1960, signaling the end of the African Empire, was just the political acknowledgement of the financial reality established in 1947. There is a darker layer to this history involving the Soviet Union. Part of the U.S. motivation for crushing the British Empire was anti-colonialism, but another part was Cold War strategy. The U.S. believed that the old European empires were breeding grounds for communism. They believed that if Vietnam remained French, or if India remained British, the resentment would drive those populations into the arms of Moscow. Therefore, the U.S. strategy was to dismantle the European empires and replace them with an informal empire of American commerce: Coca-Cola, Ford, IBM. They wanted to replace colonial administration with market access. The 1946 loan was the battering ram used to break down the colonial doors so American capital could enter. Britain was the collateral damage in America. Guess grand strategy to contain the Soviets and capture global markets. The special relationship between the UK and US was, from the American perspective, the relationship between a hammer and a nail. The tragedy of the British position was that they suffered from the victor's curse. Germany and Japan, having been utterly defeated, had their debts wiped out and their currencies reset. They started from zero. They had no imperial responsibilities to fund. They could focus entirely on manufacturing and exports. Britain, as a victor, tried to honor its debts. It tried to maintain the value of the pound at pre-war levels to save face. It tried to garrison troops around the world. This burden, combined with the U.S. financial warfare, crushed the British economy for decades. While Germany experienced the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle in the 1950s, Britain experienced austerity, rationing, and stagnation. The British people were still using ration books for meat and sugar until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. Why? Because the government needed to export the food to earn dollars to pay back the American loan. The British working class literally starved to pay the interest on their victory. This historical pivot point is essential for the modern investor to understand because it illustrates the ruthlessness of the reserve currency holder. The United States is often viewed as a benevolent hegemon. But the history of 1946-1956 proves that the U.S. will ruthlessly use its financial power to deindustrialize and subordinate even its closest allies if it serves U.S. interests. We saw it with the British Empire in the 1940s, we saw it with Japan in the 1980s, Plaza Accord, and we are seeing signs of it with Europe today, energy dependence and deindustrialization. The dollar system is designed to extract value from the periphery to the center. When Britain tried to act independently at Suez, the system crushed it. The lesson is clear. In a dollar-denominated world, sovereignty is an illusion for everyone except the printer of the dollars. As long as you need their currency to buy oil, they own you. The only way to escape is to find a way to buy energy without their currency, which explains exactly why the modern BRICS nations are so obsessed with creating a non-dollar trading rail. They have studied the history of the British Empire, and they have no intention of becoming the next victim of a convertibility crisis. The humiliation at Suez in 1956 did not just end the British Empire, it birthed the modern offshore financial system. Defeated and stripped of its imperial possessions, the British establishment faced an existential crisis. They could no longer be the world's policemen, but they refused to become a museum. In a stroke of desperate genius, the bankers in the City of London realized that while they could no longer control the source of the money, the U.S. Treasury, they could still control the flow. They discovered a loophole in the U.S. banking regulations that would allow them to reinvent London not as the capital of sterling, but as the capital of the shadow dollar. This was the creation of the Eurodollar market. And it is the reason why London remains a financial powerhouse today, despite the UK's industrial decline. The mechanism was accidental. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had a problem. They earned US dollars from selling oil, but they were terrified of keeping those dollars in New York banks, fearing the US government would freeze them, a fear that was justified, as we saw with Russia in 2022. So the Soviets deposited their dollars in a British bank in London, the Moscow Narodny Bank. Crucially, the Bank of England decided not to regulate these deposits. They took the view that if two foreigners want to trade foreign currency in London, that is none of our business. This created a regulatory vacuum. U.S. banks in New York were heavily regulated, interest rate caps, reserve requirements. U.S. dollars held in London banks, Eurodollars, were completely unregulated. This meant London banks could offer higher interest rates on deposits and lower interest rates on loans than New York banks. Capital flooded across the Atlantic. By the 1960s, there were more U.S. dollars circulating in London than in New York. Britain had effectively hijacked the U.S. currency. They had built a casino where the chips were American, but the house took the rake. This was the butler's revenge. Britain became the butler to the American empire, managing its money better than the Americans could themselves. But this financial reinvention came at a terrible social cost. To serve the Eurodollar market, the UK economy had to be financialized. The interests of the City of London, stable currency, high interest rates to attract capital, were often directly opposed to the interests of the manufacturing North. Competitive currency, low interest rates to help industry. Just as in the 1920s, the government chose the city. They sacrificed the coal mines, the steel mills, and the shipyards to protect the banking sector. The deindustrialization of Britain in the 1970s and 80s was not just Thatcherism. It was the logical endpoint of the strategy adopted after Suez. Britain became a hedge fund with a state attached. The wealth concentrated in London, while the rest of the country stagnated. This is the Dutch disease applied to finance. Instead of discovering oil, Britain discovered the Eurodollar. And just like an oil state, the easy money from finance crowded out every other productive sector. This history serves as a stark warning for the United States today. We are currently walking the same path Britain walked in 1956. We are suffering from imperial overstretch. We have military commitments in Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and 800 other bases that we cannot pay for with tax revenue. We are funding this empire with debt purchased by foreigners. We are using the dollar weapon, sanctions, so aggressively that we are forcing the world to find alternatives, just as the U.S. forced Britain to find alternatives in 1947. The Suez Moment for the U.S. is inevitable. It will likely happen when the interest payments on the U.S. debt exceed the defense budget, which is projected to happen in 2025, 2026. At that point, the bond market will do to Washington what Eisenhower did to London. It will force a choice: the empire or the economy. You can keep the bases or you can keep the pension system. You cannot keep both. When that moment comes, the standard of living in the U.S. will undergo a British adjustment. We will see a permanent devaluation of the dollar. We will see the end of the exorbitant privilege where we can consume more than we produce. We will have to start paying for imports with real goods, not printed paper. This means a massive drop in consumption. It means the end of the cheap stuff era. The British people in the 1950s had to get used to cold houses and older cars. The American people in the late 2020s will face a similar reversion to reality. The American dream of endless upward mobility was largely subsidized by the world's willingness to hold our debt. When that subsidy ends, the dream wakes up. So, how do you prepare for the American Suez? You look at what held value in post-imperial Britain. 1. Land. While the currency collapsed and industry died, the British aristocracy who owned land remained wealthy. Land is the ultimate hedge against imperial decline because it cannot be moved and it produces essentials: food, rent. 2. Global assets. The British investors who survived were those who owned shares in American or Asian companies. They diversified out of the declining empire. Today, this means owning assets in the commodity block, BRICS, or emerging markets that are not tethered to the U.S. debt spiral. 3. Gold. We return to this constantly because history returns to it constantly. When the pound sterling lost its world reserve status, it lost 40% of its value against gold in a few years. The U.S. dollar will suffer the same mathematical fate. The British Empire didn't end with a bang. It ended with a wire transfer. It ended when the ledger turned red. The special relationship was the relationship between a debtor and a creditor. Today, the U.S. is the debtor, the world is the creditor, and the creditors are getting impatient. The phone is ringing in the Treasury Department, and just like in 1956, there is nobody coming to bail us out.